Don't talk, just listen. I'm sorry what I did to Compton. I couldn't help it. Don't know why I had this hurt. I am so upset about it.
It was a restless time in America. The final winter of the 1970s came thick with unease, as if the nation had been carrying a bad fever it couldn't sweat out. In Iran, U.S. hostages were still trapped, the nightly news a steady drumbeat of images from Tehran. In Los Angeles, a cult of blood-drunk killers obsessed with Charles Manson still lingered in the public imagination, even as new names took up the headlines. Hillside Stranglers, Freeway Killers, the Trailside Slayer. The phrase serial killer had only just entered the lexicon, yet it was already a fixture on evening broadcasts. In homes across Middle America, parents double-locked their doors. Suburbs that once bragged of leaving keys under doormats now installed deadbolts and porch lights that never turned off. Stranger violence was no longer a distant, coastal menace. It lived in the heartland, in the neighborhoods where children once rode bikes past sunset and waitresses walked home from late shifts without a second thought. And in Minnesota, a state known for its polite reserve and bitter, quiet winters, that nightmare had arrived. On New Year's Eve, 1980, as the Twin Cities rang in a new decade with frozen streets and clinking champagne flutes, a college student named Karen Podak left a party and vanished into the night. Hours later, a high, hysterical voice crackled through a St. Paul police dispatch line. "There's a girl hurt there, by Malmberg Manufacturing. Please, send a squad." When officers arrived, they found Patak barely alive in a snowbank, her skull split open by repeated blows with a tire iron. She would survive, but the damage left her memory erased. The voice was anonymous. The man on the other end sobbed like a child. It would not be the last call. What followed was a string of random ritualistic killings and weepy anonymous phone calls that haunted investigators for 2 years. The media dubbed him the Weepy-Voiced Killer, a man who would kill and then, as if gripped by some desperate Catholic guilt, phone police in a trembling, remorseful wail. "Damn, will you find me? I can't stop myself. I keep killing somebody." At first, the victims seemed unconnected. A young woman from Wisconsin, a nurse. A schoolteacher drowned in her own bathtub. The randomness was what terrified the public most. In a time when serial murderers were supposed to stalk hitchhikers and sex workers on the fringes, the Weepy-Voiced Killer chose women at random, without pattern, without reason, and then sobbed into payphones like a man possessed. Behind the voice was Michael Stephani, a devoutly Catholic Minnesota janitor with a history of childhood abuse, a failed marriage, and a simmering hatred for the world around him. His crimes would claim 3 lives, leave 2 women for dead, and terrorize a region already bracing itself against the rising tide of stranger violence. But what made Stephani different from other killers of his era wasn't just the calls. It was the conflicted, volatile nature of the man himself. A killer who begged for absolution seconds after murder, whose remorse sounded real even as his hands bled from ice-pick stabs. And like so many of his contemporaries, from Richard Ramirez to David Berkowitz, Stephani's descent into violence came amid a national atmosphere primed for monsters. America was a country both terrified of and fascinated by its killers. And in the shadow of the Vietnam War, Watergate, and cult atrocities like Jonestown, men like Stephani felt the world unmoored and took it as license. He would die in prison of skin cancer in 1998, but not before confessing to the full tally of his violence, begging forgiveness, and confirming what authorities long suspected. The random cruelty of his crimes masked a private world of delusion, religious mania, and personal rage. This is the story of Michael Stephani, the Weepy-Voiced Killer, and how a man consumed by guilt, fantasy, and rage helped turn the quiet streets of Minnesota into a crime scene, and his own conscience into a confessional booth he could never leave. Before there was a voice on the line, trembling, high-pitched, almost childlike, there was a boy. His name was Paul Michael Stephani, born into a modest Catholic family in Austin, Minnesota, on September 8, 1944. The second of 10 children, Stephani's earliest years were a blur of strict religious ritual and domestic unrest. When Paul was just 3, his mother remarried, bringing a stepfather into the house who would leave a mark deeper than any Sunday sermon could undo. By his own account, the man was a cruel and volatile presence. In police interviews years later, Stephani described a home where affection was sparse and violence was currency. If the children crossed him, the stepfather would lash out. Open-handed slaps to the back of the head, sharp cuffs to the ear, and sometimes, without warning, he would hurl them down the narrow staircase of their cramped family home. "We learned early to stay small, stay quiet," Stephani told one interviewer in his final year of life, his voice raspy and thin from cancer. "And to be afraid." The family attended Mass religiously. Paul clung to the rituals of the church like a drowning man to driftwood. Confession, communion, Hail Marys whispered in the dark before sleep. But where some children find solace in faith, Paul found only the crushing weight of sin. He was told the world was wicked, that temptation was everywhere, that hellfire waited for those who faltered. And Paul faltered often.
By his teens, Stephani was already in trouble. Petty theft, truancy, fistfights with neighborhood boys. The small-town police knew his name, though they rarely held him for long. After high school, like so many young men with nowhere to go, he drifted to Minneapolis-St. Paul, taking up odd jobs, shipping clerk, janitor, machinist, never holding one long enough to gain a reference, always leaving under a cloud of minor infractions or unexplained absences. Somewhere in those years, he married a local woman, Beverly Leiter, and fathered a daughter. The marriage was brief, ending in divorce and bitter custody disputes. Stephani abandoned both wife and child, slipping back into a pattern of unstable employment and quiet isolation. Colleagues described him as polite, even deferential, but something about him felt off. A former supervisor at Malmberg Manufacturing Company, where Stephani worked as a janitor in the late 1970s, recalled his obsessive neatness. "He cleaned things that didn't need cleaning," the man said, "and he never liked to be touched." Stephani's world shrank. His social life, such as it was, revolved around bar rooms and bus depots. He drank alone. He spoke little. And then, in 1977, he was fired from Malmberg Manufacturing for reasons no one could quite recall. The building, with its empty parking lot and unlit loading dock, would become the site of his first known attack 3 years later, as if marking the place where the man he had been finally fractured. But if Stephani was unraveling, no one noticed, or no one cared. By the time the 1980s arrived, America was in the throes of a serial killer panic. From Son of Sam to Ted Bundy, from John Wayne Gacy to the newly arrested Golden State Killer, it seemed a new face of horror appeared every month. Headlines screamed of mutilated co-eds and suburban slaughter, while television movies dramatized the unseen monsters hiding behind neighborly smiles. Even polite, stoic Minnesota was not immune. In this jittery, fearful climate, Paul Michael Stephani finally struck. And when he did, he spoke. "Please, send a squad." It wasn't bravado. It wasn't taunting. It was something stranger, something more chilling in its naked vulnerability. The Weepy-Voiced Killer didn't gloat or threaten. He sobbed, he begged, he confessed, over and over again. To the police who answered those calls, it sounded like remorse. To psychologists later, it sounded like control. For Stephani, it was a compulsion, a ritual, one as sacred to him as any childhood catechism. He would spill blood, then he would confess,
Then he would hide. New Year's Eve, 1980. St. Paul, Minnesota. While crowds packed bars on University Avenue, and ice-clad streets echoed with noisemakers and the reckless joy of an anxious nation, desperate to leave the 70s behind, a young woman named Karen Potak stepped out into the brittle December night. It was below zero, the kind of cold that stiffened your breath and made the skin sting beneath wool mittens. She was walking alone through the industrial backlots near Pierce Butler Road, a dead stretch of asphalt flanked by silent factories and empty machine shops. At some point after midnight, Michael Stephani appeared in that frozen silence. No one saw what happened. What was known came later, from the bruised geography of Karen's skull, from the imprint of a tire iron wielded again and again against her head. When police arrived, called by a high-pitched, frantic voice at 3 a.m., directing them to Malmberg Manufacturing, they found her naked in a snowbank, her brain exposed, her body a ruin. "There's a girl hurt there," the voice had said. By the time officers reached the scene, Stephani was gone. There were no witnesses, no tire tracks, no usable prints. Karen Potak would survive, but she would remember nothing. The Weepy-Voiced Killer had made his first known appearance and vanished. The phone calls were strange, even by the standards of the time. The Twin Cities police had dealt with taunts before, from obscene pranksters to belligerent drunks reporting imaginary crimes. But this was different. The caller cried. He begged. His voice broke and cracked like a child's. "I hurt somebody. I can't help it. Will you find me?" It wasn't bravado. It was a man desperate for absolution, but too cowardly to claim it. No one knew it yet, but it was only the beginning. June 3rd, 1981. St. Paul. Her name was Kimberly Compton, 18, fresh out of high school, newly arrived from Pepin, Wisconsin to the city she hoped would offer her work and a new life. That afternoon, she left the Greyhound depot, carrying nothing but a small suitcase and a job application in her purse. By nightfall, she was dead. This time, the weapon was an ice pick. 61 puncture wounds clustered in her chest, stomach, and inner thighs. The violence was manic, disproportionate, a frenzy, not a murder. There was no evidence of sexual assault, no theft. Only a young girl discarded like refuse near a freeway construction site. 48 hours later, the calls came. "I don't know why I had to stab her. I'm so upset about it." The dispatcher froze. The man on the line knew about the ice pick. That detail had been withheld from the press. Another call. And another. "God damn, will you find me? I just stabbed somebody with an ice pick. I can't stop myself. I keep killing somebody." Each message was the same cracked, pitiful voice. The killer wasn't mocking them. He was pleading. "I'll try not to kill anybody else," he promised. It was a lie. July 21, 1982. Roseville. Kathleen Greening was found face down in her bathtub, drowned in her small suburban home. She was 33, a school teacher, kind and unmarried. There was no forced entry, no sign of struggle, no phone call came. Police ruled it an accidental death, a tragic misstep in a slippery tub. They were wrong. Years later, dying in a prison infirmary, Michael Stephani would confess. "I pushed her under, held her there." But in 1982, it was a perfect, invisible crime. August 6, 1982, Minneapolis. The bars near the Mississippi River were thick with drinkers that summer. The city stifling in its heat, the water bloated from early rains. At the Hexagon Bar, a 40-year-old nurse named Barbara Simon sipped drinks with a man she barely knew. He was quiet, deferential, a little off, but harmless enough. She'd told a waitress, "He's cute. I hope he's nice, since he's giving me a ride home." She never made it. Simons was stabbed more than 100 times. The wounds clustered and frenzied, clustered around vital organs, as though the killer were aiming at something deeper than flesh. The weapon was likely an ice pick, though the wounds also matched a Phillips head screwdriver. This time, as before, the call came. "Please don't talk. Just listen. I'm sorry I killed that girl. I stabbed her 40 times. Kimberly Compton was the first one over in St. Paul. I killed more people. I'll never make it to heaven." Now, police knew they had a serial killer, and one with a compulsion to confess. The media, always hungry for a face to attach to fear, dubbed him the Weepy-Voiced Killer. The calls, though pathetic, were strategic. Psychologists would later argue Stephani sought control over his victims, over the investigation, over his own guilt. Each call bought him time, staved off his own unraveling, like a man keeping his head just above water by confessing without consequence. "I'm sick," he said once, "and I'm sorry." If sorry means anything. The late summer heat hung thick over the city, smothering the night air in a clinging humidity that refused to lift. It was the kind of heat that felt like a weight on the chest, an invisible force that slowed the blood and blurred the senses. The kind of heat where violence felt inevitable, where streets, dark alleys, and dim motel rooms seemed to pulse with latent menace. In East Minneapolis, Paul Michael Stephani was cruising. His face still bore the faint, uneven scars from his boyhood. A narrow, pale man in his late 30s with receding hair and a permanent air of quiet discomfort. Stephani could have passed for a bookkeeper or a man waiting for a bus. There was nothing predatory in his posture. That was his camouflage. Somewhere along Lake Street, he picked up Denise Williams. She was 19. A streetwise, wary sex worker used to sizing up a man within seconds. She could spot a cop, a junkie, a chancer, but Stephani didn't register on the usual alarms. He was nervous, almost apologetic. He offered a ride. As they drove, the city lights thinned, replaced by industrial dark and back roads lined with chain-link fences. When he passed the turnoff she expected, a subtle tension sharpened inside her. She asked him where he was going. He didn't answer. When the car pulled into a dead-end road bordered by scrub grass and half-lit warehouses, Denise's instincts screamed. And then the man was on her, a screwdriver in his hand, plunging it into her chest, neck, and back. 15 times. But Denise Williams wasn't a statistic, not that night. Blinded by blood and fury, Stephani didn't see her hand close around a heavy glass bottle left forgotten on the car floor. She swung it hard into his face, the glass shattering against his cheekbone. The blow left a gash down to the bone, blood flooding his eye. Her scream carried through the dark. A porch light flickered on at a nearby house. A man, an ordinary working man on his back porch, heard the cry and sprinted toward the car. Stephani fled. He left Denise bleeding in the passenger seat, the screwdriver smeared and slick. He drove like a man already dead. But here was the flaw in his strategy, the fatal crack in his control. Stephani was badly hurt. Within an hour, he called for help. "I need an ambulance. I'm all cut up." "I got beat up and I'm bleeding," the voice said over the line. It was the same high, tremulous, choked voice that had haunted Twin Cities police for nearly 2 years. Only now it had a name attached to it. When Stephani arrived at the hospital, police were waiting. The detective who questioned him later, Don Brown, would recall how Stephani's demeanor shifted like the flick of a switch. At first, he was the victim of a robbery, a man attacked without cause. But when Brown placed the Weepy-Voiced Killer's case file on the table, Stephanie's shoulders seemed to collapse in on themselves. His voice, higher, tearful, desperate, cracked in a way Brown had only heard on those recorded calls. "You're not going to pin those on me," Stephani said, his voice rising. But in that instant, Brown was sure. When Denise Williams regained enough strength to sit up in her hospital bed, she picked Stephanie's photo from a mugshot lineup without hesitation. That's him. The next weeks were a blur of warrants, photo lineups, voice identifications. Stephanie's ex-wife, his sister, and a woman he'd once lived with all listened to the anonymous police call recordings. Each one said the same thing. That's Paul. But here's the dark genius of it. Even as Stephani sat in a jail cell, denying the killings, investigators couldn't make every piece fit. There were no direct witnesses to the Potak attack or Compton's murder. The ice pick had vanished. At trial, they could only formally charge him with Barbara Simons's murder and the attempted murder of Denise Williams. The others remained unclosed files, cold cases in everything but name. Stephani pleaded not guilty. The trial dragged. The defense strained to argue misidentification, while the prosecution leaned hard on the voice recordings, the witness identifications, and the sheer weight of coincidence. But it wasn't until 1997, 15 years into his prison sentence, that Stephani finally admitted what detective.
Dying from skin cancer, given months to live, Stephani reached out to authorities. He had one request: a photograph of his mother's headstone. In return, he would talk. And he did. "I did it," Stephani said, his voice rasping but unmistakable. "I hurt those girls." He confessed to beating Karen Potak, stabbing Kimberly Compton 61 times, drowning Kathleen Greening in her bathtub, stabbing Barbara Simons to death, and attacking Denise Williams. He told police there was a voice in his head. "Paul, it's time to kill." After each murder, he said, he'd sit in the back pew of a Catholic church, weeping silently, asking for forgiveness. He believed the phone calls might buy him absolution, that by confessing anonymously, he was striking a deal with God. "Mother always told me, if something hurts you, go to God," Stephani said. On June 12, 1998, Paul Michael Stephani died in the infirmary at Oak Park Heights Maximum Security Prison. He took no more secrets with him. The Twin Cities were no stranger to blood. By the early 1980s, Minneapolis and St. Paul had weathered their share of violence. Barroom stabbings, back alley beatings, domestic murders born of cheap liquor and long winters. But the Weepy-Voiced Killer left a wound that didn't heal cleanly. This one felt different. It wasn't just the brutality of the crimes or the randomness of the victims. It was the voice. That high, sobbing, almost childlike voice that slipped through the phone lines in the dead of night, confessing sins in real time. It lingered in the public consciousness, a phantom whisper at the edge of the city's nerves. People swore they could still hear it, in late-night radio static, in the high whine of a police siren, in the sound of a crying child in the next apartment over. "God damn, will you find me? I can't stop myself. I keep killing somebody." It was more than a confession. It was a curse, a city on edge. In the weeks after Stephani's arrest, the Twin Cities tightened like a fist. Newspapers ran composite sketches and breakdowns of his timeline, alongside public service announcements on how to spot a predator. Bars posted signs warning women to stick together. Cab companies reported a spike in late-night rides as women abandoned the idea of walking home alone. The Hexagon Bar, where Barbara Simons had met her death, saw a sharp drop in customers. Regulars avoided the back booths. The payphone near the restrooms, once the site of drunken confessions and lovers' quarrels, sat unused, a grim reminder. And yet, even in death, Stephani's grip on the city didn't loosen. When word spread in late 1997 that Stephani, dying of skin cancer, had confessed to all 5 attacks, it confirmed what law enforcement had long believed but never fully proved.
But the details he shared chilled investigators even after so many years. He remembered everything. Not just the stabbings and beatings, but the sound of the ice pick cracking cartilage. The way Kimberly Compton's blood looked under the glow of a street lamp. The drowning of Kathleen Greening. The way her hair fanned out in the water. The tiny air bubbles clinging to the tiles. He recalled what he ate that day. What the air smelled like. What music played on the radio as he drove to meet his victims. The clarity was obscene. Even in his final days, Stephani showed no remorse in any conventional sense. There was no plea for forgiveness, no justification. Only the same disjointed mixture of terror and submission, as though the killings were acts of possession rather than volition, as if he were a passenger in his own body. Paul, it's time to kill. The line blurred between predator and penitent. Was he a sadist racked with guilt, or a coward desperate for some imagined cosmic loophole? No one could say. Today, few remember Paul Michael Stephani's face. Even his moniker, the Weepy-Voiced Killer, sounds like something invented for pulp fiction. But the cautionary lesson he left behind remains carved into law enforcement textbooks. Predators don't always look like monsters. Remorse is not the same as redemption. And a killer who weeps can still kill again. His story endures because it defies expectation. He wasn't the cold-blooded psychopath of thriller novels or the charming sociopath of true crime lore. He was something murkier, more unsettling. A man who claimed to hate what he was doing, begged for deliverance, and did it anyway.